Greetings, everyone. Welcome to our exclusive Global Leading Voices webinar campaign. We are delighted to have you join us here today. Please be informed that if you have any questions during the presentation, you may type them into the question box in your control panel. The presenter will answer your questions at the end of the presentation accordingly. Now, without further ado, we will turn the time over to our presenter, who will begin shortly.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I'm Andrea Bonin-Blanc. I'm the founder and CEO of GEC Risk Advisory. I'm speaking to you today live from New York City, where I'm based, and it's a pleasure to have such a global audience. And I look forward to not only presenting my presentation to you, but also hearing your comments and questions and having an opportunity to discuss some of these issues with you towards the end of this live broadcast. Just a quick sort of summary of who I am. I'm someone who was born and raised in Germany and Spain. I'm based in New York City. I do business globally. I'm a lawyer by training, spent several years at a couple of big law firms, and then went in-house at several large global companies and smaller ones as well, over about a 20-year period, holding executive roles such as general counsel, chief risk and compliance, and ethics officer, heading up several other functions, including cyber risk governance and corporate responsibility. So my background is very diverse, and almost 5 years ago, I started my own firm where I provide advice to a cross-sector of public, private, nonprofit organizations around the world on topics of strategic and tactical governance, risk, ethics, compliance, reputation, and crisis management. So I try to provide sort of a strategic, holistic view of all of these interconnected things. And you will see that from my presentation that what I'm trying to do is help both management and boards think about these non-financial topics in a holistic, strategic way, because even though they may not be financial to begin with, they can be financial in their outcome in terms of a bad reputation leading to loss, or a good reputation leading to value creation. So with that said, let me start with a few slides that sort of paint a picture that I'd like to use a little bit in terms of what is a strategic risk and what is reputation risk. So all of you have, I'm sure, read the headlines over the years on a variety of different issues, scandals, crises, topics that have challenged major global corporations. And as you can see from this and the next few slides that I'm just going to show you, this is a summary or a vision of some of the important brand names that you have seen in the auto sector over the years who have had challenges, whether they are challenges having to do with quality, environmental health and safety issues, or even corruption issues and quality issues in the case of a couple of the brand names on your screen. And you sort of ask yourself, are these one-off situations, are these one-off risks that these companies have faced, or are they a part of a larger pattern of issues? Maybe they're sectoral issues, maybe they have something to do with the automotive industry. And that is one of the sort of key questions I think that each of us needs to ask when we're working within a specific type of organization or industry. Are we confronting this issue or dealing with this issue on our own, or is it a more systemic issue, a more systemic risk that exists within the sector that we're working in? So this is something that the press and the media have often tackled. There was an interesting Economist cover story a couple of years ago, well, a year and a half ago, when the Volkswagen story broke out, and it was called "Dirty Secrets of the Car Industry." And you ask yourself, are these issues that happened only at Volkswagen, or are they issues that happened at other companies around the industry and beyond? And so, for example, in the case of the emissions scandal that we all have been reading about, and new developments seem to occur pretty much weekly or monthly. Are these issues that only belong to Volkswagen, or did they have an impact or a presence in other car companies? And what we are finding is that yes, these risks of environmental violation, of health and safety issues, of potential fraud and misrepresentation. These are issues that a number of car companies have either confronted or actually been responsible for. And since the Volkswagen case, you've probably read about how Mitsubishi also had defeat devices on their environmental software going back quite a few years. And other companies, car companies, are under investigation for the same kind of issue that Volkswagen has been paying dearly for since late 2015, when their story first arose. So my question really is, how did these risks begin? When did they become strategic risks? When did they become reputation risks? And so another interesting piece that I came across in the Financial Times recently is this one that says the Volkswagen scandal shows that corporate culture matters. And I think that is one of the key takeaways that I would like to share with you today, is that when you see some of these endemic or systemic problems within a company and within an industry or a sector, these are issues that go above and beyond, let's say a quality risk or an environmental health and safety risk. They go to the corporate culture and to the leadership of the organization. It's the tone from the top that gets set. So I think there's a lot to unpack here, and I would like to proceed now with a slightly more sort of focused discussion of what it is to what a strategic risk is and what a reputation risk is, and just to sort of finish up on the Volkswagen case, which is a really big case, and I think something that we will all see in the business casebooks and the ethics casebook studies in universities and beyond for the next few years. Volkswagen in 2012, as many of you know, was lauded as the largest auto company in the world. It was one of the top 10 in terms of capitalization and stock market value. In that year, they became the #1 auto company in the world. And only 3 years later, we had this sort of destruction of value, destruction of reputation, and predictions by analysts, as you can see from this one newspaper clip here, that Volkswagen's emissions scandal could cost $86 billion when all is said and done. And this was a Credit Suisse analyst looking at the story back in 2016. Now, whether that reaches, whether 86 billion is the right number or not, we know already that they have paid many billions of dollars in settlements and otherwise, acknowledging that they violated the laws, and they have a number of other pending cases around the world. So this will continue for a while. And just as a reminder, for those of you who've been following the BP Deepwater Horizon Gulf of Mexico case, there too, the consequences, the longer term consequences of that one terrible disaster in the Gulf Coast, which killed 11 people and polluted the Gulf of Mexico and destroyed businesses and the interests of many stakeholders at the end of the day. That case so far, the latest number I've seen, and this is about 5 years out now, has cost BP approximately $63 billion in financial consequences and reputational consequences. So these things are not without really serious financial and other consequences. This is an article that I wrote. You can find it on my website under Thought Leadership. It's an article I wrote for Ethical Boardroom magazine about a year ago, in which I analyzed what happened at Volkswagen. And just to give you the summary of what I think happened, it started with basically cheating software that was inserted into various car models years ago, apparently, and we don't know the full story yet, but we're getting there. So it started with the company deciding to violate environmental laws, deciding to misrepresent to the customer what they were buying in terms of emissions, and also lying to other stakeholders like regulators. And it then evolved into something much bigger than a violation of environmental or fraud laws, and into became clear that it was a much bigger leadership and culture risk issue. And so it went from being what could have been a manageable risk if somebody had caught it early on and put an end to it, to something much more systemic and deeper that is that I think is a leadership and culture risk, which very few of us talk about properly, which then had also reputation risk consequences. So let me go into now sort of the nitty-gritty of what I think a strategic risk is and what reputation risk is, and then give you some further color and ideas on what I mean by that. So what is a strategic risk? I offer you a few definitions here, and then I'll end with my own. But basically, the Business Dictionary defines strategic risk as a possible source of loss that might arise from the pursuit of, let me just move this over here. Okay, from an unsuccessful business plan. For example, strategic risk might arise from making poor business decisions, from the substandard execution of decisions, from inadequate resource allocation, or from failure to respond well to change in the business environment. So we're talking about strategic risk really affecting the business, and I think that that is the core principle here. The Conference Board has a more succinct and also good definition that says that strategic risks are risks that are most consequential to the organization's ability to execute its strategies and achieve its business objectives. These are the exposures that can ultimately affect shareholder value or the viability, the long-term sustainability of the organization. So that's I think a very succinct and useful definition as well. And then I have a definition here from a chief risk officer from Australia ANZ Bank, which I really like as well, because it sort of puts a little more color on what I think strategic risk is and what I think we all should be thinking about it, which is that it's not about doing it the way we used to do it, but to be creative and innovative in our thinking around defining what a strategic risk is. And so with that, you know, I've already mentioned the leadership and culture risk issues, reputation risk issues. These are the sort of the leading edge risks that are out there that can be strategic and will be strategic, that you really need to pay attention to and incorporate into your enterprise risk management system or worldview on risks generally. So here's my contribution to the definition of strategic risk, which gives you a little more sort of the positive and the negative, or the you know, the impact. So what I think strategic risks are is that they're the risks that offer uncertainties and or opportunities, and are the most consequential to an organization's strategy and its ability to execute on its strategy. And what I also add here is the potential impact on one or more stakeholders, including shareholders and shareholder value, and on the long-term viability of the organization. So you can see that my definition here is sort of a combination of a couple of things that I read to you a moment ago, plus offering this sort of twist, which I think is really important to bear in mind, that it's not just about the downside, it's also about the upside and the opportunities on the one hand, and then it's not just about impact on shareholders and shareholder value, but other stakeholders who can then also indirectly impact the value of the organization. So I think it's really important to think about strategic risks as not only downside and upside, but also as affecting a multitude of stakeholders. So with that said, I have a little picture here that's from a book that I wrote a couple of years ago on reputation risk, where I tried to sort of give a global view of where strategic risk fits in the universe of risks. And so if you have all risks as the big bubble, inside that bubble you have strategic risks. And then inside that bubble, it depends often on the business that you're in, the kind of activities that you pursue, your products and services, your footprint, et cetera, et cetera. But at the end of the day, there are certain things that rise to the level of strategic risk, something I call inherent strategic risk, and reputation risk is one of them, and that's why we're talking about it in conjunction with strategic risk today, and I'll talk to you in greater depth about it in a few minutes. But also part of this strategic risk bucket are other major risks, depending again on your business, your footprint, your products, your services, your employee footprint, etc. But technology risk could be one of those strategic risks, and I think very seriously about this. I work in the space of looking at new technologies and the governance risk and ethics around those new technologies, like artificial intelligence, for example. That could be a major strategic risk. Maybe, you know, in the past we would refer to them as black swan risks, but frankly, it's not something that you never thought of and never could have happened before. So I think of technology risk like AI, for example, to a regular traditional business, not as a black swan risk, but as a strategic risk that if you're not thinking about it and incorporating it into your strategy, your business, your tactics, you are running a very serious strategic risk. If you are able to incorporate those things into your thinking, you are actually creating that strategic opportunity I was talking about a moment ago. Other kinds of strategic risks would include geopolitical risk, for example. Without getting into politics, I think that there have been some major changes in geopolitical risk in the last year or two, affecting both the viability and attractiveness of investment in two countries where geopolitical risk was unheard of in the past, the US and the UK. So we have to sort of be agile and adaptive and open to understanding that strategic risks can come and go and change very quickly depending on what's important to your particular business and its footprint. Climate risk is clearly a very serious issue. Compliance risk can become a systemic strategic risk as well. And then, of course, the leadership and culture risk piece that I talked about. Many of you are familiar with what's going on in the banking industry. Many of you are maybe even in the banking industry. And so there, you know, for example, that more and more, both in the, you know, several jurisdictions that I'm familiar with, such as in the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and the financial authorities in the UK and in other places, there's more and more of a focus on conduct risk, which to me is another way of saying leadership and culture risk. So again, that's sort of the worldview. And now I want to sort of delve a little more deeply into reputation risk, which to me is a form of strategic risk. And here I share with you the definition from my book, The Reputation Risk Handbook, which I wrote about 3 years ago, and I believe it still holds very much true to what I stated here. And let me just explain my view of reputation risk. I don't view it as a standalone risk that a company or an organization will suffer from. I view it more as a transversal, cross-cutting risk that affects other risks that you might have one way or another. And so let me just read out the definition because I think it's important to sort of just get the nuance here. I view reputation risk as an amplifier risk. I also see it as an accelerator that layers onto and attaches to other risks, especially ESG risks, and I'll go back to that in a minute. Adding negative or positive implications to the materiality, duration, or expansion of the other risks on the affected organization, person, product, or service. So really, say you're an oil and gas company and you know that some of your strategic risks are health and safety, environmental, regulatory, geopolitical. If you are minding the store and you are evolved and sophisticated in assessing your risks, you have an enterprise risk management program, you have competent talent that's overseeing these issues, you have a great sort of collaboration between risk and audit and legal and the businesses, and then you have a good flow of the information that is necessary for the executive management to understand these risks and the board to understand these risks. If you have that evolved system in place, you will be in a very good place should there be a crisis, should there be a scandal, should there be an issue that arises related to that risk. What that means then is that your reputation risk associated with that risk will not be severe, it will be manageable. You will be prepared, you will manage that risk and that crisis well. And you may even come out of that situation with a reputation enhancement because the organization handled the risk well, knew that the risk was there, and understood the impact of those risks on their stakeholders. And I'll give you a few examples as we go through today. When I sort of emphasize in this definition the idea that it's especially ESG risks, we're talking about environmental, social, and governance risks. And there, again, those are the risks that we often bucket as the sort of the non-financial risks, but they all have serious impacts, serious consequences, both for good and for bad, on the stakeholders of the organization. So this is something where I think reputation risk is especially important to think about. But reputation risk can also amplify financial risk that hasn't been properly handled. So one of the things I have on this slide that I like to point out is that one of the inspirations to the work that I've done in reputation risk was an Economist Intelligence Unit piece that came out in 2007. They were way ahead of everybody, as they normally are, in identifying important business topics. And they came out with a study that basically said that reputation is the risk of risks. So I feel like I'm in good company when I talk about this topic, because it's something that really layers on to everything else that you're doing in your organization. And if you're not incorporating it into your thoughtful sort of risk management and issue management process, you're missing an important piece of the puzzle. As I've already mentioned a couple of times, one of the really important things to think about, not only for all kinds of risks and strategic risks, but especially with reputation risk, is the key role of stakeholders. Stakeholders have expectations of how you will operate as a business, as an organization, as a government agency around the world. Those stakeholders may be the ones that you see on this slide, they may be others, but there are reputation stakeholders out there that have a stake in what you are doing as an organization. And if you're doing something at the expense of one of these stakeholders, that will hit your reputation, it will hit the trust that they have in you, etc. So I think it's really important to always think about risk, strategic risk, and reputation risk in the context of your key reputation stakeholders. This is another picture that I've used over the years to sort of explain again just a couple of thoughts that I think are important, and I've already sort of mentioned. But the idea that, you know, if you have big buckets of risk and you're developed ERM program, enterprise risk management, think of reputation risk as that risk that's transversal, that cuts across all types of risk. And so depending on what your business is and your footprint and your people, your regulatory profile, reputation risk will be associated with those risks, and even more so for the strategic risks that you might have. I like to use as an example, I wrote a piece about a year ago. It's called Cyber Reputation Risk Turbocharged for Ethical Corporation magazine. And in this article, what I was trying to do is sort of identify what I thought at the time, and I continue to think this is true, that because cyber risk and cybersecurity is such relatively new and serious, cutting edge, even existential topics that companies are really ill prepared to deal with. And I know this because I do a lot of work in this area, and I work with companies to try to get their directors and their executives, their board of directors and their executives, to think about cyber risk governance as a very important piece of the puzzle in terms of managing cyber risk. Because if you don't end up having some form of cybersecurity in place, cyber risk management, cyber risk philosophy, depending on what kind of a company you are, your reputation is going to be hammered. And I think, you know, so the idea here is this is a very cutting edge example of reputation risk layered on top of another risk, which is cyber risk. And I don't need to tell you about the stories that we're reading almost daily. We sort of crossed an important threshold in the last few months with the ransomware attacks that have sort of attacked companies and organizations around the world through the Internet of Things. This is just the beginning, and we are going to see much more. And unlike many of the risks that corporations, for example, face, that are traditional risks that they are able to manage and and deal with. Cyber is something where there has to be a private-public partnership, where there needs to be collaboration across sectors. This is much bigger than any one company can handle, so there has to be a conscious effort by leadership of an organization to tackle what they can do on their own, and then in collaboration with the sector or the public sector. So again, I really recommend people thinking about cyber risk not only in the context of having a good program in place, but the reputation risk consequences that might come. Here on this slide, I just have a few examples very quickly. I'm not going to talk about each of these. I actually will talk about a couple of them in a few minutes. But you know, the question here is, these companies, Yahoo, Wells Fargo, Odebrecht, Samsung, and Volkswagen, have all faced major issues in the recent past, some of them having to do with cybersecurity, like Yahoo, Wells Fargo, consumer fraud issues, Odebrecht, fraud and corruption throughout Latin America. Samsung, product safety is one of the notorious issues, but they've had other issues, corruption. And then Volkswagen, as we've mentioned, consumer fraud and environmental issues. And there are different sectors, as you can see, and the footprint of these scandals has been either global or local or regional. And so the question, you know, I would ask, and if you're a member of one of these companies or similar companies, were these risks strategic? Were these risks reputation risks? Were they both? I would suggest to you that they were both, because each of these companies has gotten hammered in the court of public opinion. They've gotten hammered by their stakeholders. Many of them are continuing to be affected, like employees and consumers and regulators and the media. So once you sort of cross the threshold of having a serious risk that becomes a strategic risk, it also can become a reputation risk. On the other hand, I always like to think about the upside of things as well. And one of my main messages, and you'll see this a little bit later in the presentation, is that for every risk, there's an opportunity. And if you're dealing with your risks in a way that that is proactive, that is thoughtful, that is you know, pragmatic and protective of your stakeholders, you will see strategic opportunities and reputation opportunities. And I just want to mention a few of these cases because I think it's really worth mentioning. Again, you have a variety of companies from around the world with you know, headquarters in different countries, and with risks that became opportunities in various areas, various issues or ESG areas that that you can see on this page. Human rights in the case of IKEA, anti-corruption in the case of Morgan Stanley and GE, diversity and inclusion in the case of L'Oreal, and health and safety in the case of Fonterra. And I'm going to mention the Fonterra case specifically because I think it's a really interesting case, and one that I've studied in greater depth, and it's part of, it's a case study that I have in my book, the Reputation Risk Handbook. And there, it was a situation where a few years past, Fonterra, as some of you may know, is a New Zealand-based dairy multinational. It's a large company with I believe, the largest market share in dairy products in Asia. And they typically were selling dairy products into the Chinese market. And a few years ago, as you all might recall, there was a terrible incident where some baby formula was tainted and several babies died, and hundreds of thousands of babies were taken ill. Now, this wasn't Fonterra's product, but Fonterra was using in its supply chain a local company called Sanlu, which was found to be responsible for the tainting of this baby formula. And the company Sanlu ended up going bankrupt, and even their executives were executed by the Chinese authorities. So it was a very serious situation. The way Fonterra dealt with this crisis, first of all, they didn't have good crisis management at the time, and they were tainted by association with this supply chain company in China, although they were not directly responsible. They had to sort of think about, how do we do business in China going forward, given the risk to our reputation, but also the risks in terms of health and safety, product quality, etc. And instead of fleeing the market or continuing to do business as usual, they completely changed their business model. They took advantage of this risk, of this crisis, and turned it into an opportunity for a better business model. And that better business model was basically to be the majority owner of the facilities within China where they were producing their products. And that way they would have much more control over the quality, the supply chain, etc. The end result was that their market share increased substantially and their revenues went up. So to me, this is a really great example of a company that faced a very serious crisis and risk, and then put on its thinking cap in a very productive, constructive way to see how they could be in a market that was challenging, but certainly the biggest market they were going to be able to sell into. So to me, that's a great example. There's others here on this page, but I do want to go into a few more things before giving you some ideas about how you would identify and deal with strategic risks and reputational risks. So I want to take a bigger picture, sort of pan out, take a 60,000-foot view of the world right now, because I think it really helps to explain why reputation risk is so important, why strategic risk is changing. And it's these 5 trends that I think are clearly very important for your consideration on doing business today. So let's start with the first one. Trend number 1, trust, the decline in trust. This is something that I'm not saying it, it's actually something that's been measured by a leading public relations and communications firm called Edelman, who has been producing this Edelman Trust Barometer for I think a dozen years, give or take. And every year they basically survey and interview people around the world at different levels of seniority within companies and outside. And they ask for those people's opinions on how much they trust 4 different categories of organization. So you'll see here NGOs, business, media, and government. And what they have found, not only this year in 2017, but continuing a trend from 2016, is that trust in all 4 institutions has declined. And not only has it declined, but if you look at the right side of this slide, you can see that 2 out of the 4 institutions are actually distrusted, not neutral, but actually distrusted, the media and government. Now, this is the global set of figures that they came up with, but they actually produce country level snapshots of trust and so on. And you know, I encourage you to take a look, because they really do a very nice job of measuring this very important topic. Now, you will also see that for the first time ever, NGOs also declined in trust, which is a pretty amazing thing. So there's a lot of mistrust, a lot of concern, and a lot of, I think, worry in the world when it comes to the issue of trust. And certainly governments have not done much to increase our trust, and you can see that that's declining and that they are the lowest trusted. And I will speak for not only the world, but my own country. Trust is declining in a very dramatic way as well. So I think this is an important contextual thing that you need to think about. The second trend that I think is really super important to know about is that cyber insecurity is exploding. We talked about this a moment ago. This is a picture from a company that tracks cyber attacks. Basically, cyber attacks are happening at a mile a minute, every day, every second, everywhere, with certain countries doing more or less of the attacking and the receiving. But there's country level, there's you know, national actor level, there's criminal hacking, there's other kinds of hacking going on. So that's a very, very serious issue. And again, if organizations don't mind their own store, let alone sort of work with others to protect themselves and the interests of their stakeholders, it's a very serious issue. It's a strategic, systemic, reputational issue. And related to that, I think another thing that's really very important to our world is that so much is changing so quickly. The digitalization of almost everything in business and in society is changing the way we not only do business, but how we behave. If you walk down the street of any major city in the world, most people are looking at their devices and bumping into each other instead of just walking down the street. And this is a change in behavior. There's more and more sort of critical risk taking place, whether it's artificial intelligence, whether it's Internet of Things, whether it's robotics, cloud computing. It's going to have an impact on the labor forces. These are all things you need to think about in the context of your own organization. And of course, I'm not even talking about the impact of climate change, of the various sub-risks that exist within that. We just saw a major piece of Antarctica break off. There's water risk. There's the whole interconnected risk of famine, geopolitical risk, the whole issue of migration. The picture that you see on the left side of this slide is from the World Economic Forum. I highly recommend their annual global risk report, which is a very, very big picture, but very, very useful. And then there's an article that I wrote with a collaborator on our artificial intelligence, where we make the case that it's a strategic business and governance imperative, especially for the companies that are not thinking about it and so on. So these are all big risks, complex risks that are rising. Social media fueled reputation risk is clearly one of the driving forces of our time. And I didn't mention this before, but the reason why reputation risk has become such an important risk that we all need to think about is that it is fueled by social media, and social media has exploded in the last 10 years. And so even more in the last couple of years. So when you're thinking about the reputation risk of your organization, you need to think about how quickly it's going to happen, how quickly the reputation of United Airlines or Uber has been affected by some of the things that they have been seen to do. And people tweeting about it, people Instagramming, people placing comments on Reddit, you name it. These things fuel the reputation risk of an organization. And then finally, on a somewhat positive note, even in the midst of all the darkness, I guess is one way to put it, is that there's this emerging paradox, which I'm seeing in my own business and my own practice, where I'm working with some leading organizations that really want to be the high integrity, high sustainability companies that will have long-term viability, serve their stakeholders, and pay attention to the things that we've been talking about. And that is that in a world where we seem to see erosion of ethics and integrity, especially in the governmental area, we are also seeing a rise in the need to be ethical and high integrity. And I'm actually seeing corporations leading the way for a change, really seeing that it is in the best interest of the business to have a high integrity culture that basically serves the interests not only of the shareholders, which they will serve when they don't get into trouble and they mind their risks, but also serves the interests of other key stakeholders, namely customers, employees, and prospective employees. So we're living at a time when there's this really strange paradox where ethics is down and ethics is up, and I choose to believe that long-term integrity and sustainability are gonna win the day. Okay, let me talk quickly here about a couple of other things before we spend a little time hearing your questions and comments. The Wells Fargo case, again, is a case that I think all of you might have followed, where it was discovered that there was basically a culture of dealing with sales in a very aggressive and fraudulent way, where the salespeople on the front lines were incentivized to open as many accounts as possible without the permission of the customer, and it created just a sort of a waterfall of problems once it was discovered. And so you can see the last headline here: Wells Fargo new accounts tumble 44% in wake of sales scandal. Here's an interesting graphic. I work closely with RepRisk. It's a Swiss company that does big data analytics on reputation risk, and basically what they do is every day they collect data from media and social media from all over the world, tied to the names of about 80,000 companies and organizations, and they track the negativity of the media on, I think it's about 40 different topics or issues, and they're mostly ESG issues. And you can see here with Wells Fargo how the RepRisk index went up as the scandals were discovered in 2016. Volkswagen is another case study. I'd love to show these slides because I think they give you a graphic and numerical quantitative view, something that's really hard to quantify. And that is when you look at this graph, you can see in July of 2015, right before the scandal hit, their reputation risk was pretty low. It was like a 30, 34, maybe 35. And then the scandal started to unfold and it hit peak of the peak reputation risk index of 77 in October, November of that year. And it hasn't really gone down. It's stayed very high. And so there's this index that goes from 1 to 100. And, you know, anything above 50 is a high risk. Anything above 75 is a super high risk. And then it also is compared against the sector. And if you look at Volkswagen's current reputation risk index at 64, this is as of June of this year. But if you look at compared to its sector, the rest of the sector is at 36. So this shows you that there are some issues there, right? In contrast, I want to show you the reputation risk index for L'Oreal, which is a company all of you, I'm sure, know. It's got a great ethics program and culture and an excellent corporate responsibility and sustainability program. It's very avant-garde and cutting edge, and it minds its business when it comes to risks. And as you can see, it's really never had in the last 2 years a high risk on anything. And that's because they really do pay attention, and I know this for a fact because I'm familiar with the company. If you look at a side-by-side comparison of the stock performance of these two companies, Volkswagen and L'Oreal, you'll see over a period of 5 years that while Volkswagen on the left side had this great increase over time all the way up to mid-2015, where they had become the #1 company in the car company in the world, et cetera. Then there was this very, very major plummeting of the stock price right after the scandal started to unfold. In the case of L'Oreal, even though they have their ups and downs, the general trajectory over 5 years has been on the up and up. So again, maybe it's a not complete direct correlation, but there is definitely a relationship between value creation from a stock market standpoint and reputation. Again, why the difference? My theory is that in one company, they knew what their risks are, they manage for them, they create a culture of integrity and sustainability, while in the other one, it was a much more rogue culture, and we're still learning more about the whole Volkswagen case. I'm reading a book right now written by an investigative reporter. It's really good on the Volkswagen situation. I haven't quite gotten to the end yet, but the bottom line in this book, written by Ewing, E-W-I-N-G, is that the culture and the leadership risk was there way back then when the company was created, going back to the pre-World War II period. So it's a very interesting study of culture and of leadership. Okay, so now let me give you a few tools before we wrap up and leave some time for questions on how you should be thinking about strategic risk for your own organization. And I have a piece that I've been writing, and that's going to be part of a new book that I'm writing, where I sort of lay out a multi-filter strategic risk lens, where you pay attention to several different things around a risk to understand whether it's a isolated risk and a risk that is manageable locally or in a temporal way, or something that could grow over time into a strategic risk, which then has to be brought to the attention of management, whether it's in the country, in the region, or globally, and even to the attention of the board, where the board of directors ideally is going to be presented the enterprise risk management program of an organization, and they are not interested in every nuance, they're interested in the strategic risks. So I'll show you a picture here, again, part of something that I'm working on, that gives you sort of 8 different, it's the lenses that I showed you before, 8 different ways to sort of understand over time and over sort of the intensity of an issue, whether or not something becomes strategic. And it includes, where is the risk located? What is the issue about? Is it an issue that is core to the business, like environmental emissions, for example, for Volkswagen? Or is it a tangential issue? There was a small IT failure in a small local office somewhere. Who are the stakeholders that are being affected? This is also extremely important. Is it an isolated event that affects one stakeholder, or is it something that's repeated over time, that's affecting several stakeholders, not only locally but globally? The context of the issue is, what's the geographical context? What is the materiality of the risk? What is the timing? Is it an isolated thing that happened, or is it happening in the ordinary course, or is it sort of an emergency? What resources are being deployed? Is it localized? Is it, do you need to get the legal department involved? Do you need to get audit involved? So that can also give you a sense of how important that issue might become over time or immediately. And who do you need to report this issue to? So with all these different filters, I think you get a better sense of when a risk can become strategic. I've also built sort of a model of leadership, risk, engagement, and governance. And so for the strategic risks, you can have one of 5 different models, depending on whether your leadership, meaning both the board and the executive team, are engaged and risk aware, and whether or not the strategic risk exposure is low, medium, or high. And so in the low risk, low awareness, there's the complacent model where not much is done, it's reactive, which is a problem, but you know, it's no news is bad news until it happens. On the higher alarm level is the irresponsible model, where you know you have high risks or medium to high strategic risk exposure, and you have a lackadaisical leadership that is not providing the resources or the guidance to deal with those issues. That's where things can get pretty serious pretty quickly. The vigilant model is a company that has a proactive, engaged leadership on risk issues, and they have low to medium strategic risks. They're vigilant, they'll be there when the time comes, and that's good. And then you have 2 different models on the sort of the high end of the evolutionary scale. The integrated model for a company that's decentralized, and the command and control model for a company that is centralized. So again, here's just another way of looking at sort of the forms of strategic risk governance that might exist, all the way from the irresponsible model, which is a 5-alarm fire, to the command and control and integrated models, which are good governance models for your organization. Last but not least, I do want to share with you this sort of model that I've been building since the Reputation Risk Handbook, and which I'm incorporating into a new book that I'm writing that's coming out next year, which is very simple, almost a mechanical model of how do you create a resilient organization. And really, at the end of the day, the resilient organization is one that has all the right inputs in terms of internal integrity, risk, and resilience programs. It has the board and the C-suite enabling these things to happen. Then the outputs will be both positive financial and non-financial results. Stakeholder expectations will be met or exceeded, and that creates reputation opportunity. And in the case of a disconnect between the enablers and what is going on internally in the company, there's not support for the programs, there's no resources, there's not qualified personnel, you will have outputs that will eventually be a crisis or a scandal. Stakeholder expectations will not be met, and you will have reputation risk. So sorry to run through this very quickly, but I do want to end with some time for questions. So I would just ask you, what is your role, depending on what you do in your organization, to help to identify and mitigate strategic and reputation risk, as well as opportunity? So here's my contact information, and I want to turn this over now to Andrita to talk a little bit about PECB.
Thank you, Andrea, for this great presentation. It is an honor to have you as our presenter. In addition, I want to inform you that PCB provides training and certification services for 31,000 Introduction, Foundation, Risk Manager, and Lead Risk Manager. This training is designed to provide you with the required knowledge for implementing risk management processes throughout the organization using ISO 31000 standard as a reference framework. Now, we will go ahead and take some time to answer some of the questions. Let us start with the first question. As the Chief Risk Officer in a bank, I look at strategic risk in a fourfold perspective: strategic planning, strategy execution, monitoring, and governance. What tools would you recommend for continuous environmental and business probing for both the board and management attention?
Great question, and it sounds like you have a really good program in place. And you know, in a vacuum and not knowing your organization and your stage of development, it sounds like you are well developed in this area. I think there are several tools out there. I don't want to name names necessarily, but there are reputation risk sources, information that you can use as an environmental sort of a light on where you're doing business and what stakeholders are thinking about you. There are geopolitical risk and other resources, information, subscriptions that you can take to also help you inform where you're doing business and what the stakeholders are thinking. There are tools that you can also develop yourself or with the help of outside experts on quantifying the stakeholder sort of view of your organization. So there's a sort of a quantitative piece to the qualitative piece of understanding the reputation risk, for example, that you may have in a given market, in a given situation relating to a given issue. So I think there's different things out there, but not knowing the details of where you are and what you're doing, I hesitate to give you any further advice. But it sounds like you have a good program in place, and I think the most important thing really is to be able to distill the most important strategic risks that your organization faces for your management and then also for your board. They need to be aware of these. They need to be able to do resource allocation and support you from a tone from the top standpoint and a culture standpoint. So I could go on, but let's move on to another question if there is one.
Thank you for your answer. The next question is, could you say that communicational organization strategy, it's a good step for all of the areas?
If I understand the question properly, I think maybe what your question has to do with is communicating strategic risk. And I think communication of strategic risk is extremely important, both internally and frankly, externally, if you're dealing with public disclosure obligations that you might have as a stock listed company, for example. As everybody knows, certainly in the US, but in other jurisdictions, you have to give a review of your key risks in your public disclosure. So I think I am someone who really favors over communicating versus under communicating. And I think also really part of that is cross-functional communication. One of the most successful internal programs that I've seen, it was one where there was a chief risk and audit and compliance person who sort of was the chairperson of a multifunctional, multidimensional group of people from the company. Some of them were risk owners and experts, and others were high-level executives. It was a mix, and this group would get together every month and a half to go over the cutting-edge risks and then to also create pragmatic action solutions to those risks. So communication is key, and I favor it greatly. I hope I answered the question.
Thank you. We have another question from an attendee. He says that I work in the insurance industry, and it seems that there is a short attention span from the part of senior management when it comes to discussing these topics, despite the impact of reputation and strategic risks. Would you have any idea how we can go about it?
That's a great question. I actually have a client in the insurance space, and it's funny that there would be short attention span in insurance, since insurance is the vehicle to mitigate risk. In many instances, it's a set of tools that you apply to your risks. So what I would suggest, since I've been in this situation, what I would suggest is that you start with a very sort of high impact presentation of the downsides of not paying attention to risk, and using examples from your very industry, organizations that have been hurt because they didn't mind the store, their reputations were hurt. And you will find things in the public domain in terms of cases and case studies that can help you very much. And I think I'm a true believer in using cases and real data to make your point about how important something is. And so I would suggest that it not be a lengthy and boring presentation. Instead, it be a very high impact, very targeted, very industry specific presentation with facts and figures as much as you can. So, and I think it also helps, frankly, and it's not meant as self-serving, but it helps to have an outside expert come in and rattle some cages sometimes, because that way people pay attention sometimes when they don't to the internal experts, unfortunately. I've been in that role as well.
Thank you for your answer. We will move to the following question. What are the key components of measuring reputational risk and communicating important to C-suite? How do we calculate reputational risk? It is very subjective and difficult, especially for banks, to measure and control.
Yes, you hit it right on the nail. This is not something that's easy. I would recommend that you go to my website and download a piece that I co-wrote with a quantitative expert, a mathematician, Leonard Ponzi. He and I wrote a piece last year. I think we called it Understanding Reputation Risk, the Qualitative and Quantitative Dimensions. And in there, you will see a variety of sort of perspectives, both from the qualitative side and the quantitative side. I did share with you on the screen a couple of charts from RepRisk, where they look at these things. They're snapshots in time of the potential reputation risk that an organization, or the actual reputation risk that an organization has in the marketplace based on social media and media. You can also do very customized studies where you hire outside experts to come in and measure your reputation risk with your specific key stakeholders. So that's another way to do it. But these things are expensive and time consuming potentially. So I would recommend that you look at a tool like RepRisk or some other sort of snapshot in time that helps you track your risk over time, and see also what other members of your sector are suffering from or not, what they're doing right and what they're not doing so right.
Thank you. Due to the time limitation, we will read only one more question. Why is reputation risk a top strategic concern?
So I will not just say it myself, but there was a very interesting study done by Deloitte about 4 or 5 years ago now, and there have been a number of others that have been done since then, including a couple that I've just seen recently, where CEOs and board members of major global companies from all over the world, not just US or European based, were asked, what are your top strategic concerns, strategic risk concerns in the marketplace today? And reputation risk invariably made the top 5 and has been increasing in some of the surveys and staying the same in others. You can look at Allianz, you can look at several others that have sort of global risk publications every year. And you will see that reputation risk is considered to be one of the top risks. Now, why? I think it has to do with the social media infused world that we're living in, the acceleration of information, and the sort of the ability of everybody, the democratization of information and access to technology that has allowed people to basically tweet about anything at any time. And I think it just puts a bigger onus on companies to mind their own store. Really, the underlying risks, know what those are and manage those well, and then work closely with your PR and communications team to deal with the outside world when and if the crisis happens.
Thank you. I will read just one more question. Is
Okay.
reputation a separate risk or it is a part of every strategic risk?
It's not. I don't view it as a separate risk. As I mentioned earlier, it's really not a standalone. Yes, you can have a standalone situation happen, but when you're talking about corporations and organizations, groups of people working together, it can also be government agencies. It can be any form of institution or organization. Um, the reputation risk that happens there is associated with the underlying issues and risks that that organization has. And if that organization's leadership has not provided the support, resources, and interest in understanding what those risks are, that's where that reputation risk will associate itself when there's a crisis. And I really believe strongly in the reverse as well, that those companies that really manage their risk well can really manage their reputation risk well and create opportunity and value for the organization. And so I really believe strongly that this is a win-win. This is not just about risk management, it's about opportunity creation and value creation. And so, yes, it's not a standalone, it's something that pervades and affects your other risks.
Thank you, Andrea, for this great and very interactive presentation. And I also want to thank all the attendees for joining us today. I want to inform you that this webinar is recorded and will be posted on our website and YouTube channel. Once you leave today's webinar, you will receive a survey about the presentation, and we would really appreciate if you could complete it and provide us with your feedback. Until next week webinar, thank you all and have a great day.
Thank you very much.